What if Yugoslavia had remained united? The smoke over Sarajevo never rose. The gunshots that would have echoed through Vukovar remained silent. In this world, the break did not come. Not in 1991, not ever. And yet, the pressure had been immense, nearly unbearable. The year is 1989. The Berlin Wall has fallen. Eastern Europe is shedding its communist skin. In every capital from Prague to Bucharest, regimes are toppling. Yugoslavia, a delicate federation of 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces, stands on the brink. But in this timeline, a single thread holds fast: compromise forged in desperation. It began with the unexpected death of Slobodan Milosevic. On June 28, 1989, while delivering his infamous Kosovo Polja speech, Milosevic suffers a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. He collapses on stage, surrounded by stunned loyalists. Doctors later pronounce him dead. His fiery brand of Serbian nationalism, just beginning to swell into a tidal wave, is cut off at the root. The power vacuum stuns Belgrade. But instead of chaos, there is calculation. Prime Minister Ante Markovic, a reformist Croat with a technocratic mind and a vision for a united, market-oriented Yugoslavia, seizes the moment, backed quietly by the military leadership and the aging president Lazar Mojsov. Markovic initiates emergency talks with the leaders of the republics. His gamble is bold. The country is bleeding economically, drowning in inflation and foreign debt. Ethnic tensions simmer under the surface, yet Markovic proposes a radical plan: dismantle the centralized, one-party system in favor of a confederated federal structure, a loose, decentralized Yugoslavia where the republics retain autonomy but share a common defense, currency, and foreign policy. He offers democratic elections, privatization reforms, and economic stabilization under IMF guidance. But most importantly, he offers to do it now, before the fabric tears completely. The Croatian leadership, led by a more moderate Stjepan Mesic rather than Franjo Tudjman, is skeptical but willing to listen. In Slovenia, Milan Kučan is pragmatic. If autonomy and economic liberalization are guaranteed, there is no reason to secede. The Bosniaks, wary and increasingly isolated, see Markovic as the only hope of avoiding war. Even Kosovo's Albanian leaders are promised greater rights and cultural recognition under the new framework. The military, long the guardian of the Yugoslav ideal, quietly aligns behind Markovic. With Milosevic gone, there is no singular nationalist force to counter him. The hardliners grumble but lack cohesion. By March 1990, the Dayton Charter is signed, not in desperation to end war, but to prevent it. Named after the neutral location of the talks in Ohio, where U.S. and European envoys helped mediate, the charter reshapes Yugoslavia into a confederal republic of equals. Each republic gains control over its internal governance, but mutual defense and economic treaties bind them together. A new rotating presidency is instituted, with the first chair awarded to Bosnia and Herzegovina as a symbol of fragile unity. But the deeper tensions do not vanish, they simply submerge. On the streets of Belgrade, Serbian youth whisper about betrayal. In Zagreb, nationalist pamphlets circulate in shadowy cafes. In Pristina, student protests demand more than autonomy. Yet tanks do not roll. Not yet. The will to preserve peace, born of the memory of World War II's horrors and the shared blood of partisan struggle, still holds sway. Western capitals are cautious but optimistic. George H.W. Bush sends congratulations. Helmut Kohl praises the agreement. The Soviet Union, itself collapsing, offers no comment. NATO keeps a close eye, but does not intervene. And the people? In Sarajevo, an elderly man named Emir watches the television broadcast of the Dayton signing with tears in his eyes. He served in Tito's army. He remembers when this land nearly tore itself apart the first time. Maybe this time, he says softly, we'll be smarter. But hope is not certainty, and peace in Yugoslavia is never permanent. The road ahead will not be smooth. because while one fire has been smothered, embers still glow in the dark corners of the Balkans, and that was only the beginning of the storm. Spring 1991, a new flag flies over the Federal Assembly in Belgrade. It still bears the red star, but it's smaller now, dwarfed by a white field shared equally by 6 golden symbols representing the republics. The Federation of Yugoslav Republics, as it is now called, begins its precarious dance across the geopolitical tightrope. The Dayton Charter had bought time, not harmony. The ink was still drying when the economic reforms began. Ante Markovic, now serving as the first federal premier of the new confederation, wastes no time. Backed by foreign loans and cautious Western support, he slashes subsidies, floats the dinar, liberalizes trade, and pushes through mass privatization. Factories in Slovenia and Croatia benefit first. They have the infrastructure, the education, and the EU connections. Serbian industries, bloated by years of central funding and mismanagement, struggle. In the south, Kosovo and Macedonia receive little attention. Their economies remain agrarian and stagnant. Discontent ferments. To manage growing unrest, Markovic forms the Federal Reconstruction Agency, run by a diverse panel of experts: Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Albanians. It's a noble gesture, but lacks teeth. Every decision must now be approved by the Confederation Council, where each republic holds veto power. And already, those vetoes are being weaponized. The first major test comes in July 91, when the Slovenian government announces it will impose tariffs on goods imported from Serbia, citing market protection. Markovic calls it a violation of the Dayton Charter. The Slovene delegation walks out of the council session in protest. That same week, on the outskirts of Ljubljana, a small group of nationalist paramilitaries is arrested with weapons smuggled in from Austria. The Yugoslav People's Army, JNA, demands jurisdiction. But Slovenia refuses. A standoff ensues. Markovic intervenes personally, traveling to Ljubljana to negotiate. He succeeds. Barely. The men are tried in Slovenia, but under federal oversight. But in the army barracks across the Federation, the mood is shifting. General Veljko Kadijevic, a loyalist to the idea of Yugoslavia, but no friend to civilian rule, grows uneasy. He sees fragmentation, not federation. If this continues, he tells his senior staff, we'll be a common market of enemies by 1995. In Sarajevo, President Alija Izetbegovic walks a razor's edge. Bosnia's Muslim population is growing anxious. Though the Dayton Charter promised protections, they remain a minority in a republic riddled with Serb and Croat enclaves. Izetbegovic fears a silent demographic war more than any military one. His aides advise him to demand stronger federal guarantees. He hesitates. He knows pushing too hard could reignite dormant flames. Meanwhile, the youth grow restless. In Zagreb, university students protest privatizations that leave thousands jobless. In Niš, Serbian workers strike, demanding renationalization. In Pristina, the Albanian underground press accuses the Confederation of institutional discrimination. The dream of unity is rapidly becoming a nightmare of bureaucracy and blame. And yet, there are glimmers of possibility. A cultural renaissance is blooming. Yugoslav film, music, and literature begin to flourish under the relative openness of the new confederation. A joint film project, Stone and Flame, depicting the partisan struggle during World War II, wins awards in Berlin. Rock bands tour from Skopje to Ljubljana without permits. Journalists write more freely, albeit under heavy scrutiny. Markovic clings to these signs. He gives speeches filled with cautious optimism, urging patience. Our struggle, he says in a televised address, is no longer one of arms, but of ideas. Let us not fail on the battlefield of the mind. But across the border, in a newly reunified Germany, intelligence reports describe Yugoslavia as a ticking puzzle. The CIA, watching closely, warns the White House that a second Cold War could ignite if the Balkans fracture again. this time with NATO and post-Soviet Russia both poised to intervene. And in Moscow, now under Boris Yeltsin, Yugoslavia becomes a symbol, the last socialist federation still standing. Russian hardliners view its survival as proof that the union they lost might have endured with stronger leadership. But not everyone mourns Milosevic. In the dusty heart of southern Serbia, a former party official named Vojislav Šešelj begins to organize secret meetings. His rhetoric is sharper now, raw, open, and venomous. "They have robbed us of our destiny," he tells a roomful of men in Subotica. But the Serb spirit cannot be bound by treaties written in Ohio. And somewhere in the shadows, those words begin to echo. In Zagreb, a Croatian intelligence officer intercepts a Serbian arms shipment labeled as agricultural machinery. In Mostar, a mosque is defaced with nationalist graffiti. In Banja Luka, a church is firebombed. The federal police respond with arrests and denials. But whispers are louder than headlines, and trust, once lost, is not easily rebuilt. Still, the Confederation holds, for now. The price? Constant vigilance. And as Markovic steps off a plane in Brussels, seeking full EU observer status for the new Yugoslavia, he knows the truth. Every handshake he offers is weighed against the ticking of a clock he cannot see, a countdown to an unknown reckoning, because in Yugoslavia, peace is never given. It is borrowed from a future that may not arrive. And what came after was even more unexpected. Autumn 1992. The hills of Kosovo are quiet, but beneath the silence, something stirs. To outsiders, the region appears calm. No open rebellion, no mass protests. But the air hangs heavy like the pause before a storm. The Dayton Charter had promised autonomy, language rights, and local self-governance for the Albanian majority province. But in practice, implementation had stalled. Federal ministries dragged their feet. Serbian police retained a heavy presence in Pristina. Schools that were supposed to teach in Albanian still lacked proper materials. Cultural centers remained shuttered. For many ethnic Albanians, Dayton had not been liberation. It had merely changed the mask on their oppressor. In response, Ibrahim Rugova, the soft-spoken leader of the Democratic League of Kosovo, maintains his doctrine of passive resistance. Under his leadership, Kosovo establishes a shadow state. Underground schools, secret clinics, even an unofficial parliament meeting in living rooms and basements. It is a government without guns, but not without power. But a new generation is losing patience. They call themselves the Liria Front. Formed by disillusioned students and former Yugoslav army conscripts, Liria rejects Rugova's nonviolence. They want change through confrontation. In October 1992, a Yugoslav border post near Jakova is bombed. 3 soldiers die. The act is never claimed, but whispers swirl. Federal authorities tighten patrols, and a quiet crackdown begins. In Belgrade, the news stuns Markovic. He had hoped Kosovo would be a model for minority rights under the Confederation. Instead, it's becoming a fault line. The Federal Council debates emergency powers. The Croatian and Slovenian delegations push for restraint. The Serbian representative, now increasingly influenced by nationalist voices back home, demands military deployment. Markovic vetoes the proposal. Instead, he flies to Pristina, not with troops, but with cameras. On live television, he walks the crowded streets with Rugova at his side, promising investments, new schools, and cultural autonomy. "We are all Yugoslavs," he declares, "and we will not abandon any part of our family." The stunt is effective, for a moment. Western media praise his courage. Washington offers conditional aid for the Kosovo Reconstruction Initiative. But the Liria Front is not impressed. That night, a federal police vehicle is torched. A leaflet left behind reads, "You cannot reform chains." Across the Adriatic, Italy watches nervously. NATO naval patrols in the Ionian Sea increase. Greece demands a briefing on the Albanian question. Albania itself, now unstable, corrupted, and impoverished, issues a fiery speech at the UN calling for protection of ethnic Albanians in occupied Kosovo. In response, Russia accuses Albania of stoking separatism. Moscow, still reeling from Chechnya, supports Yugoslavia's territorial integrity. For the first time since the Cold War ended, a geopolitical chessboard is unfolding in the Balkans once again. Meanwhile, in Sarajevo, President Izetbegovic calls for a summit. "We cannot let one province destroy us all," he says. The summit convenes in Skopje, where leaders from all republics, minus Montenegro, which abstains in silent protest, debate Kosovo's future. The result is the Skopje Protocol, a 10-year roadmap for Kosovar self-rule under federal supervision. It includes an Albanian language university, control over local policing, and economic autonomy. It's hailed as a compromise. Rugova accepts, Liria rejects it. But on the ground, peace needs more than paper. The JNA begins rotating out older officers and replacing them with younger, more loyal commanders, veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War who had joined Yugoslavia's ranks in the 80s. Among them is Colonel Milan Bogdanovic, a hardliner with a quiet disdain for federal politicians. He is assigned to oversee security operations in southern Serbia and northern Kosovo. His first directive, monitor all mosques for subversive activity. His second, stabilize the region by any means necessary. The tension spreads beyond Kosovo. In Zagreb, nationalists seize upon the conflict as proof that Yugoslavia cannot function. They call for Croatia to take emergency sovereignty over its laws. Slovenia follows suit. The federal government pushes back, accusing the republics of eroding the constitutional order. And the army, still loyal but increasingly alienated, begins preparing contingency plans. Codenamed Operation Mistral, these include rapid response deployments in case any republic attempts unilateral secession. But the real battlefield isn't in the barracks. It's in the minds of the people. Across Yugoslavia, families debate in kitchens and over factory lunch tables. Is this worth it? This confederation? Some still cling to hope, the idea that peace, however strained, is better than the bloodshed their parents saw. Others grow resentful. Why should Croats pay taxes to fix roads in Kosovo? Why should Bosniaks trust an army commanded mostly by Serbs? In Montenegro, usually silent, President Momir Bulatovic begins voicing concerns. The federation must either become a true partnership or dissolve with dignity. His words resonate far beyond the sleepy streets of Podgorica. And yet, amid the rising rhetoric, there is also resilience. A joint Yugoslav basketball team wins silver at the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona. The players, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, weep together on the podium. For a moment, the Federation remembers what it once was. But symbols can't mend fault lines. In January 1993, a Yugoslav army patrol is ambushed near Mitrovica. 5 dead. Liria claims responsibility. Federal troops respond with a raid on a suspected safe house, killing 2 teenagers and a schoolteacher caught in the crossfire. Rugova begs for calm. Markovic orders an inquiry. But it's too late. In cafes and churches, in mosques and union halls, the question is no longer whether Yugoslavia can survive. It's whether it should. And in the smoky back room of a nationalist bar in Banja Luka, a former JNA officer mutters into his drink, "We won't be one country much longer, but we might be one battlefield." And that was only the beginning of the unraveling. Spring 1993. The snow melts in Sarajevo, revealing the scars of a winter not marked by war, but by tension. Crackling. Brittle, like ice on a frozen river. Alija Izetbegovic, president of Bosnia and Herzegovina, sits beneath the portrait of a younger self in his office atop the presidency building. He's reading a report, confidential, damning. Bosnian Croat militia groups have begun training exercises in the forests outside Mostar, claiming they're preparing for civil emergencies. The weapons are legal, the drills unofficial. But the message is clear. They're getting ready. the Muslim-Croat alliance in Bosnia is fraying. The fragile unity held together by the Dayton Charter and Markovic's diplomacy is collapsing under competing visions. Bosnian Croats, emboldened by support from elements in Zagreb, seek greater autonomy within Bosnia. The Bosniaks, fearful of partition, see any such move as a prelude to secession. The Serb enclaves in eastern Bosnia watch in silence, biding their time. And above it all, the Federation government seems increasingly paralyzed. Markovic is tired. His once unshakable confidence is now a mask. At a federal council meeting in Belgrade, he pleads for unity. "We are standing on a cliff's edge. One misstep, one act of ambition cloaked in nationalism, and we all fall." But the council is no longer listening. Slovenia has effectively withdrawn from federal participation. Its economy, now firmly integrated into Central Europe, has boomed. Ljubljana is pushing for associate EU membership as an independent partner. Croatia, too, is making overtures to the West, using backdoor diplomacy to test the waters of recognition, should it break away. The army, though still nominally under federal control, is split in loyalty. Ethnic Croat officers increasingly defer to Zagreb. Bosniak commanders are asking if their troops would obey orders from a Serb general. And among the Serbs, a new name is rising: Ratko Mladic. In this timeline, Mladic is not yet the infamous figure he became in our world. He is a disciplined, if stern, military officer stationed in Sarajevo. But the nationalist circles in Pula, the de facto capital of Bosnian Serbs, see him as a man of destiny. Mladic remains loyal to the federal command, for now. But his patience wears thin. Then comes the spark. On April 12, 1993, a bus carrying Bosniak civilians en route to Gorazde is stopped at an unofficial checkpoint outside Foča. They are ordered out by masked men in paramilitary gear. The driver, a Serb, pleads with them, says this isn't the way. The gunmen ignore him. They force the passengers into the woods. 12 are later found dead in a ravine. International outrage explodes. The UN, already monitoring Yugoslavia with increasing scrutiny, demands an independent investigation. Human Rights Watch sends observers. CNN airs grainy footage of the bodies. The images shock the world. Markovic, in an emergency address, calls the massacre an attack on the soul of Yugoslavia. He orders a full military inquiry, but local commanders deny federal jurisdiction. The Serb Republic of Bosnia, unofficial but growing in confidence, claims the victims were terrorist sympathizers and warns against outside interference. Izet Begovic, silent until now, speaks before the Federal Council. "If we cannot protect our people, then we have already lost the right to call ourselves a nation." His words ignite fury and fear. Croatia threatens to unilaterally secure its citizens in Bosnia if the federation fails. Serbia, still nominally under the federal banner, mobilizes internal security forces along the Drina River. And in the skies above Sarajevo, for the first time, NATO surveillance drones are detected by Yugoslav radar. The streets respond. In Tuzla, thousands march in candlelight vigils. In Banja Luka, Serbs hold counter-rallies, accusing the media of bias. In Split, Croatian youth deface federal buildings. In Novi Pazar, Albanian flags are raised during student protests. The old mosaic of Yugoslavia, proud, complicated, fragile, is cracking. And beneath the weight of those cracks, people begin to act. In the hills of Herzegovina, Croatian militias, now calling themselves the HVO, entrench themselves around Mostar. A unit of federal gendarmes sent to negotiate is fired upon. The skirmish lasts 15 minutes. 3 dead. It's the first open bloodshed since the Confederation began. Markovic scrambles to contain it. He calls in UN mediators, offers broad autonomy to Croat areas within Bosnia, and even proposes a trilateral presidency for the Republic. But no one trusts anymore. The promises of Dayton, unity, equality, shared destiny, seem like ancient myths in a land now ruled by fear and faction. And through it all, Russia and the United States circle like hawks. In Moscow, nationalist voices call for support to the Serbs, our Orthodox brothers. In Washington, senators begin pushing for economic aid to Croatia and Slovenia to encourage democratic transition. The Balkans are becoming a chessboard again, one where pawns bleed and kings hide. Then, in late May, it happens. In a bold, unauthorized move, a coalition of Bosnian Croat and paramilitary forces surrounds the federal garrison in Mostar. They issue a single demand: withdrawal within 24 hours. The federal commander refuses. Fighting erupts. The siege of Mostar begins, not just a battle for territory, but for the soul of Yugoslavia. And while gunfire rings out across the Neretva River in Sarajevo, President Izetbegovic stares out his window, listening to the distant sound of helicopters. "We kept the war away for 4 years," he murmurs to his aide. Maybe that was the miracle. But miracles rarely last in the Balkans, and as the sun sets behind the jagged skyline, a new era dawns, one of fractured loyalties, broken promises, and the first true test of a nation built not on blood, but on hope. And hope now is running out. Summer 1993. The city of Mostar burns. Stone bridges, once symbols of multicultural harmony, collapse into the Neretva River under the pounding of mortars. The federal garrison, once a neutral force keeping Croat, Bosniak, and Serb militias apart, is now itself under siege. Inside, nearly 600 soldiers, engineers, and civilian staff huddle in makeshift bunkers. Outside, the HVO encircles them with artillery and snipers. What began as a standoff has become a bloodbath. Ante Markovic, watching the footage from a command center in Belgrade, feels the weight of failure crush his chest. Every day of hesitation, every compromise made to appease nationalist republics, now plays back in his mind. Mostar was never supposed to fall. Not to rebels, not to fragmentation. And yet, here it is. To the world, the siege is a warning. The BBC runs the headline, "Is this the end of Yugoslavia?" The New York Times calls Mostar the Stalingrad of the Balkans. French intelligence warns the EU that if the city collapses, Bosnia will follow, and the Confederation may fracture within months. But Markovic is not ready to surrender Yugoslavia. At an emergency meeting of the Confederation Defense Council, he demands authorization for a full-scale counteroffensive. His top military advisor, General Zoran Arangelovic, supports him. "Let us remind them," the general says, "why this federation has an army." The response is tepid. Slovenia refuses to participate. Croatia walks out entirely. Bosnia, divided internally, abstains. Only Serbia, Macedonia, and Montenegro approve. But that's enough. Operation Iron Shield is approved, a rapid deployment mission to break the siege, evacuate federal forces, and reassert control over Herzegovina. 3 days later, Yugoslav Air Force jets streak over the mountains. The assault is swift and brutal. Paratroopers land on the outskirts of Mostar, while mechanized infantry advancing from Trebinje engage HVO checkpoints. For 72 hours, the city is a war zone. House-to-house fighting tears through the old town. The iconic Stari Most Bridge is caught in the crossfire and collapses into rubble. When the dust settles, the federal flag rises once more over the eastern half of the city. Mostar is technically reclaimed, but the cost is staggering. 1,300 casualties, over half of them civilians. In Zagreb, the Croatian government declares the operation an act of war against the Croatian people. Slovenia echoes the condemnation. Western governments freeze military aid and impose targeted sanctions on Yugoslavia. The UN Security Council holds a heated debate. Russia blocks a resolution condemning the offensive. The United States abstains. Inside Yugoslavia, reactions are split. In Belgrade and Skopje, federalists cheer the victory. In Banja Luka and Tuzla, people mourn the losses and whisper fears of escalation. In Sarajevo, the mood is grim. Izetbegovic fears retribution from both Croat and Serb factions within Bosnia. And in Kosovo, the Liria Front sees an opportunity. While attention is fixed on Mostar, they launch coordinated attacks across Pristina, Djakova, and Peja. Police stations are bombed. Rail lines sabotaged. For the first time, Albanian separatists seize and hold territory. The response from Colonel Bogdanovic is merciless. Dozens die. Hundreds vanish. The Federal Council descends into chaos. In late July, the Croatian and Slovene delegations formally suspend their participation in all federal sessions. Izetbegovic, under pressure from both Western diplomats and internal moderates, proposes a temporary dissolution of the Federal Union for Bosnia, to be revisited after new elections. It's a veiled threat of secession. Markovic, once the architect of peaceful reform, now finds himself surrounded by ghosts, the ghosts of his own idealism, and of a country he no longer recognizes. He calls an extraordinary press conference. Standing before the shattered windows of the federal parliament, flanked by soldiers in soot-covered uniforms, he addresses the nation. We built this federation as a promise to the past and a bridge to the future. That bridge has been bombed, yes, by hatred, ambition, and betrayal. But we still stand, and I cannot, allow this nation to collapse into tribal violence. We are not a confederation of enemies. We are a union of survivors. If we forget that, we lose not only our country, but our souls. The speech reverberates across Yugoslavia. Some call it heroic, others call it delusional, but no one ignores it. In Washington, the tone shifts. A back channel opens between the CIA and Yugoslav intelligence. In Brussels, EU diplomats float the idea of a Balkan Stability Compact, contingent on a ceasefire and return to federal talks. And in Moscow, Yeltsin sends a private message of support. Hold your line. We know what it is to lose a union. But the military realities are unforgiving. Federal forces now occupy half of Herzegovina, most of Kosovo, and maintain presence in Sarajevo. But supply lines are stretched, morale is low, and defections are rising. A secret memo from the JNA reveals that nearly 18% of officers have expressed unwillingness to fight further, especially in missions against their own ethnic kin. Then, in a move that shocks the region, Izetbegovic reaches out. He proposes a summit, not in Belgrade, not in Sarajevo, but in Thessaloniki, under the neutral auspices of Greece. He invites leaders from every republic, every faction. Markovic agrees. For the first time since the Mostar offensive, the possibility of peace flickers again. But as the delegations prepare for Greece, intelligence services intercept a chilling message from a radical Croat militia. If they rebuild Yugoslavia in Thessaloniki, we will burn it in Zagreb. And so, as diplomats board planes and hopes begin to stir once more, the fate of Yugoslavia hangs by a thread, not of law or treaties or borders, but of time. And time, in the Balkans, has a habit of running out. Thessaloniki, Greece, September 93. The air was thick with salt and suspicion. Diplomats descended upon the ancient port city like a parade of ghosts. They came from Zagreb and Sarajevo, Ljubljana and Skopje, Podgorica and Belgrade. Men and women who once toasted to brotherhood now sat on opposite ends of a conference hall flanked by bodyguards and interpreters. For the first time since the Confederation's creation, all the republics were in the same room. The Thessaloniki summit was not peace. It was the last audition for it. Greek Prime Minister Konstantinos Mitsotakis opened the proceedings with a sober warning. The world is watching. Europe cannot survive another Balkan fire. The embers of 1914 still glow, but it was not Europe's scars that would shape this gathering. It was Yugoslavia's own. The agenda was clear and impossible. Izetbegovic demanded constitutional guarantees for Bosnia's territorial integrity and a redefinition of the Federal Army's role. Croatia wanted formal recognition of special administrative zones for Croats in Bosnia. Slovenia pushed for a complete economic disentanglement. Kosovo's representatives, led for the first time by a defiant Ibrahim Rugova, demanded full republic status within the federation. And then there was Serbia. Its delegation, led by the aging but calculating Borisav Jovic, came with dual purpose: preserve the army and preserve face. Serbia was tired. Bled by sanctions, protests, and refugee flows from Kosovo, it was not seeking expansion, but it would not be humiliated. Jovic made it clear federal authority must remain intact, or Serbia would walk. At the center of the storm sat Ante Markovic, hollow-eyed, gaunt, but still immaculately dressed. The architect of the Yugoslav dream tried to steer the chaos. He proposed a new framework, a union of sovereign republics, a looser political federation bound only by economic and defense treaties, modeled after the European Economic Community. The JNA would become the Balkan Defense Corps under multilateral command. A shared currency, a rotating presidency, a common passport, but no enforcement of internal politics. Slovenia and Macedonia expressed tentative support. Bosnia was divided. Serbia hesitated. Croatia flatly rejected it. "I did not come here to divide the corpse of Yugoslavia," said Croatian delegate Vladimir Šeks, "but neither did I come to prolong its suffering." Behind closed doors, darker games unfolded. Greek intelligence warned the summit of a credible assassination threat from Croatian ultranationalists. NATO increased surveillance. A car bomb was discovered near the harbor, neutralized just hours before a planned delegation dinner. The room was already divided. Now it was afraid. Yet, for a moment, something shifted. On the second day, during a late-night session, Izetbegovic and Rugova sat alone. No aides, no translators. They spoke quietly. Two men who knew what it meant to be surrounded, but not heard. The next morning, they issued a joint statement. "Bosniaks and Albanians do not seek war. We seek space, political, cultural, human, to exist without fear." That act pierced the fog. Serbia, sensing isolation, returned to the table. Even Croatia softened. Seeing the West's reactions to its hardline stance grow colder, Greece, acting as mediator, proposed an emergency addendum, the Thessaloniki Accord, a temporary freeze on all military deployments and separatist actions within Yugoslavia, overseen by a joint UN-EU observer force. It was Markovic's final gamble. He agreed to step down as premier within 6 months, allowing a new federal election to restructure the presidency. He offered an amnesty for nonviolent separatists, a reconstruction fund for Mostar, and the formal recognition of Kosovo's right to self-rule within 5 years, contingent on demilitarization of the Liria front. The chamber held its breath. Croatia asked for 48 hours to consult its parliament. Serbia demanded guarantees on minority protections for Serbs in Bosnia. Slovenia, in typical fashion, abstained. The deadline passed. And then, unexpectedly, Croatia blinked. President Stjepan Mesic, more moderate than Tudjman ever was, released a statement. "The Croatian people did not suffer tyranny only to become its agent. We will remain in the negotiations. We will not be the match that burns the house." Applause rang through the summit hall. It wasn't peace, but it was a pause. The Thessaloniki Accord was signed on September 25, 93. UN peace observers were deployed to Mostar, Pristina, and eastern Bosnia. Arms shipments from Croatia to paramilitary groups were suspended. The JNA withdrew from offensive positions in Kosovo. A civilian transitional council was established in Sarajevo, co-chaired by representatives from all 3 ethnic groups. For a brief season, the Balkans breathed again. Western newspapers hailed the summit as the rebirth of reason. The EU pledged reconstruction aid. Even the United States, long aloof, sent a delegation to Belgrade to explore future diplomatic normalization. But beneath the signatures, the ink hid unresolved fractures. The Liria front rejected Rugova's compromise and vowed continued resistance. In Banja Luka, Serb extremists called the accord a betrayal. In Mostar, the ceasefire held, but only because each side had exhausted its ammunition. And in Belgrade, as Markovich boarded a plane back from Thessaloniki, he knew what waited. Not glory, not triumph, but time bought with concessions. Still, as the coastline faded behind him, he allowed himself a flicker of belief that perhaps, just perhaps, Yugoslavia might not be whole again, but it might still be alive. And yet, as the plane touched down in Belgrade, a phone call awaited him. One of the UN convoys in Kosovo had been ambushed. 5 peacekeepers were dead. The attackers wore no insignia, and that was when the shadows returned. October 1993, February 1994. The Thessaloniki Accord had silenced the guns, for a time. But silence is not peace. Not in the Balkans. In Pristina, the ambush on the UN convoy sent ripples across the entire Federation. 5 peacekeepers, all from Finland, were dead. The attack had been swift, clinical, an IED followed by coordinated gunfire. The perpetrators vanished into the rugged hills of western Kosovo. No group claimed responsibility, but everyone knew the culprits, the Liria Front. Rugova condemned the attack immediately. So did Markovich. But their words rang hollow. The international community demanded action. And in Belgrade, Colonel Milan Bogdanovic, now operating with increased autonomy, began to act. He declared all of Drenica, the cradle of Albanian resistance, a federal security zone. Journalists were barred. Civilian movement was restricted. Mass arrests followed, mostly young men, teachers, and suspected sympathizers. Human Rights Watch reported allegations of torture in Mitrovica, but the federal government, desperate to hold the Thessaloniki line, dismissed the claims as anti-Yugoslav propaganda. Then, in January 1994, a video surfaced. Grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. It showed federal troops raiding a village, burning homes, and executing 2 young men with hands tied. The footage aired on CNN. In Brussels, EU officials froze all reconstruction aid pending investigation. The fragile trust born in Thessaloniki began to unravel. Markovich summoned Bogdanovic to Belgrade. The colonel refused the summons. That defiance marked a quiet but critical moment. A line had been crossed. The military was no longer responding uniformly to the civilian government. The JNA was fragmenting, unofficially but inexorably, into regional fiefdoms. Bogdanovic in the south, Mladic in eastern Bosnia, Croat generals aligning quietly with Zagreb, and in the north, a silent majority of officers just trying to keep their men fed and the borders closed. Meanwhile, in Sarajevo, the transitional council created by the Thessaloniki Accord was in disarray. Tensions between Croats and Bosniaks flared again. Local elections saw nationalist parties sweeping the suburbs. The idea of shared governance in Bosnia, the last experiment in coexistence, was becoming a cruel joke. Izetbegovic knew it. So did Mesic. So did the people. In Tuzla, a protest turned deadly when a grenade, source unknown, exploded in a crowd of demonstrators demanding federal police withdrawal. 9 dead, dozens wounded. Ethnic blame followed immediately. Croats accused the Bosniaks. Bosniaks blamed Serbian agitators. No evidence emerged. No arrests were made. And then came the blow that shattered what little remained of the Federation's credibility. In February 1994, a leaked document from the Serbian Interior Ministry revealed direct arms transfers to Serb militias in eastern Bosnia, despite Belgrade's public commitment to demobilization. The leak, traced back to a disillusioned staff officer, hit global headlines. Washington responded with fury. President Bill Clinton suspended all diplomatic talks with the Federation. Russia, though still nominally supportive, withdrew its observers. France and Germany began planning a multilateral force to replace the failing UN mission. The message was clear: Yugoslavia had lost the benefit of the doubt. Inside the Federation, panic set in. Markovich gave a somber address, declaring an emergency review of the military chain of command and calling for the resignations of all regional commanders. He offered to step down entirely if it would preserve peace. But his calls were no longer commands. They were laments. In Zagreb, message declared that Croatia would not participate in any future joint military operations. Slovenia began preparing legislation for a full constitutional referendum on independence, this time with the EU's quiet approval. Macedonia reinforced its southern borders, wary of spillover from Kosovo. Only Montenegro remained steadfastly loyal. But even there, President Momir Bulatovic faced internal dissent from younger politicians seeking a new future, unshackled by dead ideologies. And in Pristina, a new figure emerged, Adam Shala. He was not like Rugova. Shala had fought with the Liria Front since the beginning. Charismatic, ruthless, and media-savvy, he posted videos calling for an Albanian spring. His message was clear. Dayton was a lie. Thessaloniki was a cage. The only path is out. His face began to appear on posters, in student dorms, on graffiti walls. Even in Tirana, whispers grew. Was Albania ready to act? And amid all this, the unthinkable happened. In the early hours of February 18, 1994, a car bomb exploded outside the Federal Assembly in Belgrade. The blast killed 11 people, including a prominent Montenegrin parliamentarian and 2 staffers from Markovic's inner circle. The security footage showed the bomber, a man with no known affiliations, no clear motive, and no face. But theories blossomed like weeds. Some said the Lira Front. Others whispered of Serb ultranationalists trying to incite martial law. Western intelligence quietly considered the possibility of foreign interference, a destabilization effort by Russian hardliners or rogue Croatian operatives. Whatever the truth, the consequences were immediate. Markovic declared a nationwide state of emergency. Federal troops were placed on high alert. Travel between republics was restricted, and for the first time since the Confederation's founding, border controls reappeared, manned not by customs agents, but soldiers. In Belgrade, tanks appeared on street corners. In Sarajevo, the Transitional Council suspended all public sessions. In Mostar, the ceasefire lines hardened. In Pristina, black flags waved in the wind, signaling something far older than protest. Nice, rebellion. The Thessaloniki Accord was not yet dead, but its body was cold, and somewhere in the darkness of a fractured land, as rumors of war again filled radios and newspapers, a quiet truth emerged. Yugoslavia had not failed because its people were enemies. It had failed because no one, not leaders, not armies, not even the well-meaning reformers, could tame the weight of its history. And now, that history was coming back, not as memory, but as vengeance. March 1994. The wind that once carried chants of unity now bears the sound of marching boots. In the early days of spring, as snow begins to thaw on the slopes of Mount Igman, what remains of the Yugoslav Federation begins to splinter, not with declarations, but with silences. Communications between republics are reduced to formal statements. Embassies within Yugoslavia start to function as if they were between foreign states. The dream of a confederation has narrowed into a quiet stalemate, its heartbeat growing faint. And then it breaks. On March 12th, the Slovenian National Assembly passes the Sovereignty Act, a legislative move declaring all federal laws and military structures invalid within Slovenian territory. Though not an official secession, it is effectively a divorce from the federation. There are no tanks, no protests, just cold efficiency. Slovene officials shut down federal offices in Ljubljana overnight. The police take over JNA barracks without resistance. The EU issues a cautious statement of support. In Zagreb, emboldened, Croatia follows suit. But here, the transition is not smooth. Federal troops stationed near Karlovac receive conflicting orders. One battalion refuses to evacuate without written authorization. Local Croatian militias surround the compound. Shots are fired. 3 soldiers are killed. The news explodes across regional media. Within 48 hours, riots erupt in Split and Osijek. Federal symbols are torched. Croatian flags rise in their place. Markovic convenes the Emergency Federal Council in Belgrade. But only Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia send full delegations. Croatia's seat is empty. Slovenia's chair is removed entirely. The president, still refusing to resign despite his earlier vow, delivers what would be his final address before the council. I did not come to lead Yugoslavia into war. I came to save it from the past. But the past has voted. 2 days later, he resigns. The resignation of Ante Markovic sends shockwaves. Western capitals call for calm. NATO moves warships closer to the Adriatic. Russia issues a statement urging non-intervention in Slavic internal affairs. The United Nations requests emergency access to monitor refugee flows. Behind the scenes, everyone prepares for something they hoped was avoided: the total collapse of post-Tito Yugoslavia. But in Bosnia, that collapse is already beginning. And it's not clean. The Croat-Bosniak alliance, once a fragile hope, has imploded. In Mostar, sporadic violence resumes. Snipers reappear on rooftops. The UN peacekeepers, limited in number and bound by unclear mandates, can only patrol the spaces between hostile stares. The city becomes a mirror of what Yugoslavia has become: divided, barricaded, exhausted. President Alija Izetbegović faces a new crisis. Radovan Karadzic, leader of the Bosnian Serbs, declares the establishment of the Republic of Srpska within the federation. Though not officially seceding from Yugoslavia, it refuses to recognize Sarajevo's authority. Armed militias loyal to Karadzic begin fortifying the Drina Valley. Izetbegović issues a warning. It is ignored. On March 28th, in a dawn assault, Bosnian Serb militias overrun federal police stations in Zvornik and Visegrad. Over 100 civilians are displaced. The UN condemns it. NATO issues a threat of airstrikes. Russia blocks any resolution at the Security Council. In Skopje, President Kiro Gligorov fears what's coming. Macedonia is landlocked, fragile, and surrounded by potential chaos. He mobilizes reservists, fortifies border posts, and quietly reaches out to both NATO and Greece for security guarantees, a move that enrages Belgrade. And yet, in all this chaos, Montenegro remains silent. But that silence masks a choice. President Momir Bulatović, long a loyalist to the federal cause, is now under immense pressure. Younger politicians, like the rising Milo Đukanović, argue that Montenegro should pivot west, declare neutrality, and distance itself from Belgrade. The economy is in ruins. Tourism has vanished. Foreign aid depends on abandoning the collapsing union. Bulatović makes no public statement, but in private, he sends envoys to Rome and Athens. The message is clear: Montenegro will not go down with the ship. Meanwhile, Kosovo boils. The Liria Front, now unified under Adem Shala, launches a coordinated uprising across the Drnica region. It's not just guerrilla warfare now, it's an open insurgency. Police stations are overrun, roads are mined, federal forces are pinned down in isolated outposts, their supply lines severed. Reports of atrocities emerge from both sides. Colonel Bogdanović, acting with near total autonomy, declares martial law in the entire province. He orders airstrikes on suspected rebel villages. Hundreds die. Thousands flee. Drone footage leaks to the international press: rows of bodies, burned-out homes, a mosque reduced to rubble. The world watches in horror. In Belgrade, what's left of the federal command is fractured. Some demand total mobilization. Others, particularly among the younger officers, argue for a complete withdrawal. "Let them go," one colonel says. "What are we holding on to? A ghost?" But ghosts don't die easily. A final emergency session of the military high command is called. General Veliko Kadijević, pulled from retirement, is brought in as a last-ditch symbol of unity. He offers a plan: dissolve the federation into a defensive union, Serbia, Montenegro, and friendly parts of Bosnia, and abandon the rest. Save what can be saved. The plan, dubbed Operation Red Line, is put into motion. On April 3, 1994, federal troops begin a strategic withdrawal from Slovenia, western Croatia, and northern Bosnia. Bases are emptied, supplies are burned, civilian collaborators are left behind, and many are executed by local militias in retribution. The horrors multiply, and as the last transport helicopter leaves a crumbling base in Karlovac, a soldier etches something into the wall before climbing aboard. This wasn't what we fought for. Yugoslavia, in the form it once knew, is no longer a state. It is now a series of armed enclaves, failed treaties, and burning memories. And in the refugee camps stretching from Trieste to Thessaloniki, children born under a single flag now sleep beneath many, if they sleep at all. But the wars to come would not just be fought on battlefields, they would be fought in identities, in memories, in the ruins of what might have been. And that was not the end of the collapse. It was the beginning of something even darker. April-August 1994. The map of the former Yugoslavia is no longer drawn in borders. It is drawn in front lines, ethnic enclaves, and burned-out towns. International analysts begin calling it the Balkan Crucible. No longer a civil war, not yet a regional war. It is something in between. A free-for-all where the death of central authority has created a political vacuum, and into that vacuum rush militias, memories, and foreign powers. In Bosnia, the land shatters into three bleeding spheres. In the east, Radovan Karadzic's self-declared Republika Srpska now controls nearly 60% of Bosnian territory. With support from rogue elements of the former JNA and covert Russian military advisors, the Republika builds fortified positions, armed with tanks and artillery left behind by retreating federal units. In the west and south, the Croatian Defense Council, AHVO, consolidates control of Croat-majority areas. Mostar becomes its de facto capital, and with Zagreb's Yekini logistical aid and a quiet pipeline of arms from Austria and Hungary, the HVO begins expanding eastward. Caught between these two beasts is the Bosniak core, centered around Sarajevo and stretching into Tuzla and Zenica. With the federal army no longer defending it, Bosnia's Muslim population is left scrambling to organize its own defense. Izetbegovic reorganizes the remnants of the Territorial Defense Forces into the Bosniak People's Army, BPA, a ragtag, under-equipped force led by local warlords and defected federal officers. Then the siege of Sarajevo begins. Unlike the war of our reality, this Sarajevo is surrounded not just by Bosnian Serbs, but also by disillusioned former federal units from Montenegro and Serbia, who now fight for survival, or pay. The hills around the city light up nightly with rocket fire. The Olympic Stadium burns. Snipers roam the high-rises. The world watches the descent of a city once called the Jerusalem of Europe into a starving shelled prison. The UN, overwhelmed, begins airlifting food. The US deploys reconnaissance drones. NATO considers options. But the ground realities are complex. The enemy is not a single faction, but a patchwork of ethnic militias, many of whom were once allies just months ago. And then comes the turning point. On May 8, 1994, a massacre occurs in the village of Dobrinja, just outside Sarajevo. Over 300 civilians, Bosniak women, children, and elderly, are found executed, their bodies dumped in mass graves. Satellite imagery and intercepted communications point to irregular units linked to Karadzic's command. The images, broadcast across the world, spark global outrage. In Washington, the Clinton administration breaks its neutrality. For the first time, the U.S. calls for direct NATO airstrikes against Republika Srpska positions if the siege of Sarajevo is not lifted. France and Britain, initially cautious, agree. Only Russia objects, but its voice is quieter now, its military bogged down in a post-Soviet crisis. On June 2nd, Operation Iron Sky begins. NATO aircraft strike artillery positions around Sarajevo. Fuel depots and radar installations are destroyed. Karadzic declares it an act of aggression against the Serb people. But his lines falter. Serb forces begin to retreat from the hills. It is the first major international intervention, And it changes everything. In Belgrade, the weakened remnants of the federal government fracture further. The new acting premier, General Aranjelovic, calls the NATO strikes a betrayal and orders Serbia's air defenses to stand ready. But few follow his orders. The army is hollowed, exhausted, splintered. Paramilitaries now dominate Serbian politics, and the streets of Belgrade are patrolled not by soldiers, but by gangs flying nationalist banners. Montenegro, sensing its opportunity, makes its move. In mid-June, Bulatovic announces a referendum for neutrality, effectively ending Montenegro's participation in any regional war. It closes its borders, disarms federal troops, and invites UN monitors. By July, Montenegro becomes the de facto safe zone in a collapsing region, a place for diplomats, journalists, and refugees. Western leaders quietly bless this neutrality. Russia, dealing with rising instability in the Caucasus, does not protest. But peace in one corner does not stem the tide. In Kosovo, the war reaches its final escalation. Adem Shala's Liria Front now openly controls the western half of the province. Rugova, the pacifist leader, is in hiding, his influence eclipsed. Federal troops loyal to Colonel Bogdanovic hold Pristina and Mitrovica, but supply lines are cut. Urban warfare erupts. In June, the historic Hadum Mosque is shelled. The Orthodox monastery of Dechani is later set ablaze by retreating federal troops. The cultural heart of Kosovo is being consumed by fire. Then, on July 10th, a NATO reconnaissance jet is shot down over the Dranica Valley. The pilot, an American, is captured by Liria fighters. They demand recognition and weapons in exchange for his release. The U.S. refuses. Instead, they deploy Delta Force. In a midnight raid, the pilot is rescued. 6 Liria fighters are killed. 4 are captured and later turned over to the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. The Liria Front accuses NATO of betrayal. The West now finds itself fighting not only Serbian militias, but Albanian ones too. There are no longer good guys, just survivors. The European Union, terrified of further spillover, begins airlifting arms and medical supplies to Sarajevo, but also opens secret talks with Zagreb and Ljubljana to formalize their exits. A new Balkan order is being born, through fire. And yet, amidst the chaos, a question haunts every capital, every checkpoint, every refugee camp. Could this have been stopped? Could the Yugoslavia of 1989, reformed, confederal, democratic, have survived? In August 1994, former Premier Ante Markovic, now living in exile in Vienna, gives an interview to Der Spiegel. His face is worn, his voice subdued. I tried to build something that had never been built, a multi-ethnic state in a land soaked in ethnic memory. I failed, but I will never say it was impossible, only premature. The camera lingers on him for a moment, then cuts to Sarajevo, bombed out, defiant, flickering with fires. And yet, the war is not done. Because the dead may rest, but history does not. And what came next would reshape not just Yugoslavia, but all of Europe. September-December 94. The Balkan storm no longer hovers over Yugoslavia alone. Now it reaches outward, toward the Danube, the Alps, and the Black Sea. The war that had once been confined to Yugoslavia's dying body is now pulling Europe's nervous system into its violent orbit. And the world can no longer look away. The Sarajevo airstrikes had changed everything. NATO's direct involvement broke the illusion of neutrality. The siege was partially lifted, yes, but it also unleashed a brutal backlash. Across Republika Srpska, Karadzic's forces began a campaign of ethnic cleansing in earnest. Villages of Bosniaks in the Drina Valley were systematically emptied, mosques destroyed, men rounded up, women raped. By the winter's first snow, over 70,000 had been displaced. These were no longer isolated atrocities. This was policy, ethno-territorial consolidation by terror, and it was no longer ignored. On October 2, 1994, the United Nations Security Council after weeks of deadlock, passed Resolution 1029. The vote came with shocking speed. China abstained. Russia vetoed. But under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, NATO-led forces were now authorized to create and protect humanitarian corridors by force. Within 48 hours, American and British paratroopers began landing in central Bosnia. The mission? Establish safe zones in Sarajevo, Tuzla, and Gorazde. French Mirage jets flew cover. German intelligence coordinated logistics. Even Sweden sent a rapid deployment unit. What began as peacekeeping had turned into peace enforcement, a phrase that barely masked the new military reality. In Moscow, Yeltsin faced fury from nationalist opposition parties. His own government was collapsing under corruption and rebellion in Chechnya. He withdrew Russian diplomats from Sarajevo and increased covert support to Serb paramilitary units, funneling weapons through Belgrade's black market. The Balkans had become the new Cold War front. But the balance of power inside Yugoslavia had changed. The Serbian central government, or what was left of it, was now a phantom. Acting Premier Arandelović held press briefings from a bunker under Novi Sad. Belgrade itself had become a no-man's land, controlled by mafia bosses, patrolled by nationalist militias, and suffocating under Western sanctions. Montenegro had cut itself off. Macedonia was militarized but calm, buffered by a small NATO protection force at Gligorov's invitation. Kosovo remained an open rebellion, with the Liria front now fractured into splinter groups, some nationalist, some jihadist, and some just criminal. And Croatia? Croatia was capitalizing. With Slovenian recognition secured and quiet EU backing, Zagreb launched Operation White Coast, a coordinated military campaign to secure all Croat majority zones in Herzegovina and western Bosnia. Backed by European arms and military advisors, the Croatian army advanced in formation, precise, cold, and efficient. Mostar fell completely under Croat control. Western leaders looked the other way. They needed Croatia as a buffer, a stable, Christian, Western-aligned actor to counter the chaos. President Stjepan Mesić, once cautious, now assumed the role of Balkan statesman. In Brussels, he gave a historic speech. Yugoslavia has failed. Let us not fail the peace that must follow. Behind closed doors, EU ministers began drafting the Adriatic Compact, a plan to accelerate Croatian and Slovenian accession into a reimagined European security zone. What had been Yugoslavia's western edge was now Europe's new frontier. But the deeper Balkans bled. In Sarajevo, the NATO-enforced safe zone provided some relief. Aid arrived by air. The shelling slowed. But outside the zone, the war continued. The Republika Srpska shelled convoys, kidnapped aid workers, and fortified enclaves. NATO responded with more airstrikes. Civilians paid the price. Izetbegović, increasingly marginalized, issued desperate pleas. His Bosniak People's Army was barely functioning, fragmented, undersupplied, and politically isolated. The West had chosen to protect cities, not win wars. Then came the Srebrenica dilemma. In December 1994, Serb forces surrounded the UN-declared safe zone of Srebrenica, a town holding nearly 40,000 Bosniak refugees. The Dutch UN battalion guarding it had 200 men, one tank, and no clear rules of engagement. Karadzic issued an ultimatum: surrender the town or face bombardment. In The Hague, in Brussels, in Washington, panic. NATO could not defend every town. Airdrops were insufficient, and the UN had no appetite for escalation. What would happen next, in our world, a massacre, was here forestalled by a single, improbable event. A Bosnian refugee hacked a field radio, broadcasting a desperate plea on NATO frequencies. The transmission made it into the hands of an embedded CNN reporter. Within 12 hours, the images were on every screen from London to Los Angeles. Starving children, abandoned homes, a blue helmet soldier in tears, saying, "We can't stop them." The world erupted. Under immense pressure, President Clinton authorized a second wave of airstrikes, not just around Sarajevo, but directly targeting Republika Srpska command centers. On December 19, 1994, an F-16 strike obliterated a mountain command post near Pale. Karadzic barely escaped. It was a clear message. The West had drawn a new line. But while bombs fell in Bosnia, diplomacy moved behind the scenes. Germany and Austria began drafting a partition framework, not to restore Yugoslavia, but to bury it formally. The Vienna Protocol, leaked in late December, outlined a plan to create 4 internationally recognized states. 1. Slovenia and Croatia, fast-tracked into the EU. 2. Bosnia and Herzegovina, a fragile multi-ethnic state under international protectorate. 3. Kosovo, to be placed under UN administration with future status undetermined. 4. The Serbo-Montenegrin Union, a reduced Yugoslav remnant, excluded from most Western institutions, but tolerated for stability. Russia, isolated and weakened, protested but did not intervene. The world had made its decision. Yugoslavia would not be saved. It would be carved, managed, neutralized, turned from a fire into a cold memory. But on the streets of Sarajevo, in the basements of Pristina, and in the broken towns along the Drina River, no one felt rescued. They only felt abandoned. And as winter deepened and the world prepared to formalize its solution, a question haunted every corridor of power. If this was peace, what would war have looked like? January-May 1995. The peace that came to the Balkans did not ride in on doves. It arrived in briefcases, armored vehicles, and behind closed doors, thick with the smoke of compromise. The Vienna Protocol, first circulated quietly among European capitals in late 1994, now stood poised to become the blueprint of a post-Yugoslav order. Its architects, a mix of EU diplomats, NATO generals, and American State Department lawyers, had one objective: end the war by ending the fiction that Yugoslavia still existed. The logic was cold but clear. Yugoslavia was a rotting structure. The longer it was propped up, the more people died in its shadow. Only by disassembling it into manageable parts, drawing clear international borders, and placing select regions under full foreign supervision could the spiral be stopped. On January 15, 1995, the protocol was made public. It proposed the following: immediate recognition of Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia as independent states with expedited EU partnerships. Bosnia and Herzegovina would be preserved in its current borders, but divided internally into 2 autonomous entities: the Federation of Bosniaks and Croats and the Republika Srpska, under an international peacekeeping mandate for 10 years. Kosovo would be placed under full UN administration, with an international commitment to reassess its final status by 2000. Serbia and Montenegro would retain the legal successor status of Yugoslavia, with conditional access to international aid, but under heavy sanctions until the complete disarmament of nationalist militias and surrender of war crimes suspects. It was not a peace treaty. It was an imposed divorce. And like all forced divorces, it left behind bitterness. In Belgrade, street protests erupted within hours. Nationalists declared the protocol capitulation to NATO imperialism. The former army, now reduced to isolated units and local warlords, vowed to resist any foreign occupation, but they had no ammunition, no command, and no future. By February, Montenegro formally accepted the protocol. Kotor hosted the first EU observers. The tiny republic began shifting westward at full speed. A new Adriatic identity, as their press called it, was born, and with it, the final fracture of the Yugoslav military command. But Serbia refused. President Aranđelović, still clinging to power from his bunker in Novi Sad, rejected the terms. He accused the West of attempting to erase Serb identity from the map. His voice, however, carried less weight now. Local commanders in Niš and Užice began negotiating separately with NATO peacekeepers. By mid-February, Serb-held towns in Bosnia were cooperating with the international force, not out of loyalty to Belgrade, but necessity. Karadzic, hiding in the forests of eastern Bosnia, issued calls for resistance. He was ignored. In Kosovo, the Lira Front declared victory. UN administrators, backed by troops from Germany, Turkey, and France, took control of Pristina. Adam Shala, still a wanted man, vanished into the hills. Rugova resurfaced in a hospital bed, thin and broken but alive. He addressed the people with a frail voice. "We must not lose our dignity to rage. If Kosovo is to be free, it must be just." Kosovo's capital, though occupied by foreign troops, now bore the blue flags of the United Nations. Checkpoints dotted the roads, schools reopened, in both Albanian and Serbian. But suspicion hung in the air like winter smoke. The UN brought structure, not trust. Meanwhile, in Bosnia, the implementation of the protocol became a brutal exercise in forced equilibrium. Sarajevo was declared an international protectorate, governed jointly by a Bosniak-Croat council under NATO oversight. The Republika Srpska, bitter but defeated, withdrew its forces from Sarajevo's hills. Refugees slowly began returning. But homes had changed hands. Cemeteries overflowed. Revenge killings began in the dark, old neighbors with old grudges. General Ratko Mladic, implicated in multiple atrocities, went underground. Interpol issued a red notice. He became a myth and a warning, the ghost of a war that no treaty could truly bury. In Brussels, President Mesic of Croatia signed a treaty of friendship with Germany. Slovenia finalized EU accession talks. Macedonia, the silent survivor of the conflict, welcomed NATO peacekeepers and began serious negotiations for recognition under a compromise name, North Macedonia. And in Vienna, the final signatures were collected. On May 1, 1995, in a ceremony devoid of joy, leaders from the EU, the United States, Russia, and the UN gathered with representatives from the former Yugoslav republics. There were no anthems, no flags waved, only solemn speeches, too long, and the quiet scratching of pens signing the protocol into binding law. Former Premier Ante Markovic was invited. He stood in the back, a guest in a future he tried to prevent. A reporter asked him what he felt. He replied, "They ended the war, but they also ended the idea. Perhaps that was necessary. Perhaps we were never meant to hold together what history had torn apart." The Vienna Protocol was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy. Peace returned to the Balkans, enforced by tanks, drones, and tribunals. But beneath the order, new lines were drawn. In Bosnia, schools taught two histories. In Kosovo, the younger generation spoke of independence as a promise unfulfilled. In Serbia, a lost generation grew up among ruins, taught to mourn a country they never really knew. And across Europe, the phrase "never again" was once more used, this time without confidence, because the scars were not just on maps. They were in the minds of every refugee, every grieving mother, every child born under shellfire. The protocol was signed, the war was over, but peace, real peace, that was still a dream deferred. And as spring bloomed across the Balkans, a final truth began to settle like dust. The war had not destroyed Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had destroyed itself, slowly, stubbornly, and in full view of the world. And still, one part of the story remained. Summer '95. The guns have fallen silent, but the echoes remain. The United Nations blue helmets still patrol the ruined streets of Sarajevo, watching children play soccer in courtyards once littered with shrapnel. In Pristina, Albanian and Serbian shopkeepers exchange wary glances, now under the joint supervision of a multinational council. In Vukovar, the Danube runs red only in memory, not in blood. And in Vienna, the ink on the protocol is barely dry. Yugoslavia is gone, not in a single moment, not in a declaration or conquest, but in a slow, grinding surrender to entropy, a surrender to history, a surrender to the very ghosts that its founders swore would never return. But what remains? Let us step back, not as journalists, not as diplomats, but as historians of a world that never truly was. The Yugoslavia of this alternate timeline had survived longer than in our own. It had tried reform, tried federalism, tried compromise. It held together for 4 fragile, turbulent years. It had not exploded instantly in war, as it did in 1921 in our history. It had instead eroded, fought over, negotiated, manipulated, and finally carved apart not by a single catastrophic decision, but by 1,000 missed chances. And yet, the tragedy is not only that Yugoslavia fell, it is that it almost didn't. The pivotal death of Slobodan Milosevic in 1989 gave it room to breathe. Markovit's confederal reforms bought time. The Thessaloniki Accord, though short-lived, proved that ethnic rivals could still sit at the same table and speak, if only through clenched jaws. Sarajevo nearly held. Kosovo nearly found a path to autonomy without war. Macedonia survived. Montenegro evolved. Even Slovenia and Croatia walked away without full-scale bloodshed. This alternate Yugoslavia was not destined to fail. But it did, because peace was never enough. Because too many of its leaders, of all ethnicities, believed they had waited too long, compromised too much, and inherited too little. They carried old wars on their shoulders and handed new ones to their sons. And their people, weary, disillusioned, followed them, not with joy, but with resignation. Let us imagine one last scene. In a refugee camp near Trieste, a boy named Emir flips through a photo album. He was born in Sarajevo, fled during the siege, and now lives in a trailer surrounded by chain-link fences. The photos are of his parents, their wedding in 1980, both wearing Yugoslav army uniforms. His mother was Bosniak, his father Croat. They believed in the Federation. They believed in the idea. He never knew them. Both died during the final days of the siege. A UN translator approaches and asks what he wants to be when he grows up. He answers in English, "I don't know, but I don't want to be like them. I don't want to die for a country that doesn't know who I am." That boy, fictional but tragically plausible, embodies what Yugoslavia left behind. A generation that inherited not hope, but debris. And yet they are the ones now building what comes next. Whether that's Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, Serbia, or something entirely new. And the world? It learned something, but perhaps not enough. The Balkans became a warning, a cautionary tale taught in war colleges and diplomatic briefings. The Vienna Protocol was studied as a model for frozen conflicts elsewhere. But few dared ask the harder question, what if we had tried harder before it fell apart? Because Yugoslavia was more than a failed experiment. It was a mirror that showed us how easily pluralism can become factionalism, how swiftly politics can become blood, how slowly, painfully, a nation can collapse not from invasion, but from within. And that mirror still reflects, in every fragile federation, in every multi-ethnic society fraying at the seams, in every city where identity becomes a weapon. Yugoslavia is not just a Balkan story, it is a global one. A story of how quickly people forget that borders are paper, but memories are stone. So what if Yugoslavia had remained united? It nearly did. And for 4 years in this alternate timeline, it struggled, staggered, to live. But peace is not the absence of war. It is the presence of justice, of equity, of dignity shared across lines drawn by men with pens and maps. And in that task, it failed. But it left behind lessons, and sometimes lessons are all that survive. What do you think would have happened if this alternate world became reality? Would it have made our world better or worse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this journey fascinating, don't forget to like and share the video.